Hello and welcome to Required Reading, a podcast that revisits the most impactful books from our childhood. I'm your host, Erin Bowles, Internet Goblin and SAG member. And our guest today is Lana Schwartz. She is a writer who was born and raised in New York City, where she continues to live today. You can read her writing on The New Yorker, McSweeney's, The Hard Times, In Style, Shondaland, and Glamour, as well as in her book, Build Your Own Romantic Comedy, which is available wherever books are sold. Welcome, Lana.
Excited to be here.
So our book today is Gossip Girl by Cecily von Ziegesar. I looked it up at least one site, and if I'm getting it wrong, she has full permission to mispronounce my name, however she likes.
I don't think I knew that's how you say it. Ziegesar? Wow. I've been saying it Ziegesar for almost my whole life now.
2002, setting the stage. Top movies: Spider-Man, Star Wars Attack of the Clones, Lord of the Rings: The Two Towers, Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, and My Big Fat Greek Wedding. The number one song is Nickelback's How You Remind Me. American Idol has its first season. Everything is living in the shadow of 9/11. The Department of Homeland Security is created. And I could not find a lot about von Ziegesar, but she was born in Manhattan into a German noble family. She based the prep school in the book entirely on the prep school that she went to, which is Nightingale Bamford School. She lives in Brooklyn, and her social media is basically like sending her kids to college and just, I love my kids. It's all very wholesome. Lana, what is your story with this book? How did it come to you?
I don't know how quick I was to this trend exactly, because I remember reading them in high school, and I wasn't in high school yet in 2002. So I was maybe like a few years behind. But I remember like reading them voraciously because it's a series, right? It's a series, and there's at least like 8 of them or something. There's a lot of them. And then there's a spin-off series called The It Girl. And that follows little Jenny Humphrey at boarding school. So I read all of these. I remember specifically reading them in the car to my aunt's house going to Connecticut. And I was like a huge reader as a kid. I would read so much. And I remember my mom being mad at me for reading these books because she was like, this is trash. And I know you're smarter than this. And to this day, I love trash. What can I say? These books were like very, very popular. I don't know if you remember at all or what your origin story is with them, but these books were very popular. And initially, I feel like we're talking early 2000s. I feel like not long into the books being out, or like there was already talk of like adaptation.
Right.
And I remember like Lindsay Lohan was in talks to play Blair.
Oh.
And I just remember like, oh, okay, they're going to make this into a TV show or movie thing. Like these books were very in the current because like there was the A-List, I think it was called. There was the Click. There was, and then also, of course, there's Pretty Little Liars. I don't have the exact release dates for all of them, but I do think this Gossip Girl book set a trend. And then I think it was Alloy was the publishing company. And then after that, there was just like so many different types where you could just play Mad Libs, where it's like rich girl in this city with this group of friends, and they wear these designer labels, and they have drama because of this boy, you know?
I did not know this about you until today, that you were born and raised in Manhattan. Which...
No, I am from Queens, but yes,
okay.
Yeah.
But
and I live in Brooklyn now.
To someone raised outside of DC, fully counts. This is episode 8, I think, of the podcast. This book is not like my favorite, like closest to my heart that I've read, but delectable, like definitely my favorite read. I finished it and like immediately needed the second one. I'm going to read it. It's trash, but von Ziegesar is very smart with all of it, and I think it's like very well written and just tantalizing and juicy and tasty. It's so fun.
I love the idea of all these other people coming on and talking about these like books that help them through a hard time, and I was like, this is how I like learned like what designer brands people on the Upper East Side like to wear. But I think and so I meant to mention this, but I'm from Queens, and I feel like I have that classic, like if you've seen like Saturday Night Fever, that's a weird movie for me to bring up right now, but
all good.
Saturday Night Fever, or like any movie where like it takes place in the outer boroughs, right? or it takes place in the city, but there's somebody from the outer boroughs. Like the dream when I was younger, and it's obviously it's so different now, but when I was younger, the dream of the outer boroughs was to like live in Manhattan. I always thought I would grow up and live on the Upper West Side someday, like Nora Ephron, because that was a completely different world than the one I lived in. So I feel like this book and then what the show did eventually was like create this kind of like idealized dreamscape of Manhattan where the city's at your fingertips. I didn't have that, and I didn't have that kind of access. I was adjacent to it. It's like my nose was pressed up against the glass. And I actually like I knew some kids from like camp or wherever else that like lived in this world, but I didn't at all. Now it's different because like famous people live in Park Slope, but that's not what it was like when I was a kid. Yeah.
And you mentioned the show. I've never seen the show. Did you watch it? Was it?
Yeah. I was like obsessed with the show. To this day, I'm obsessed with the show. The show is really good. The show is like, it's hard for me to like, we obviously are here to talk about the book, but it's hard for me to talk about the book and not talk about the show because the book is a very good primer for what the show is. And the show, I would say, has a lot more heart than the book does. The show, like, there's a lot more that pulls at your heartstrings. And like the Serena Blair friendship, I feel like they talk about it here and like it's important. The book is definitely satirical, but it's satirical for, I'm trying to figure out the best way to say it. It's making fun of the Upper East Side. It's making fun of these kids. But I think the show, even though it's for teenagers, was satirical for an adult audience, if that makes sense. And the show was this weird, like, bringing together of, like, New York City indie with, like, high-class Upper East Side society, because they'll, like, be making fun of, like, Bloomberg, but then, like, Kim Gordon is in an episode.
Right.
Yeah, you should watch it. It's real.
I will.
I rewatch it like once a year. I sound like a freak. Sorry. Yeah.
No. I mean, off the rip, the very first thing that I loved is that it is gossipgirl.net.
Yes. Oh my God, I thought about that too. It's so funny.
And I love that it is playing with form. Like around the same time, there was, I think the first one was called TTYL, that was all in chat and email. And I think like, I don't know, for 2002, it feels kind of almost risky as a move to write it that way. And I really love it. I joke that I was in the Mormon friend group because that was the house that we would all hang out at.
Oh.
So all of this was very foreign and alien. And I think the thing that blew my mind the most, though, about it was the amount of cigarettes. And I had to go and look it up, that this was published 1 year before New York said no more smoking indoors.
Yes, I was thinking about that, too, because I was like, I can't believe they're smoking inside. That is always the biggest indicator of time to me is, can you smoke inside?
Right.
You know? And it's so funny. I think they should bring that back. That's a horrible opinion.
How did your parents treat all the bad stuff? Alcohol, sex, drugs? What was kind of the attitude?
We didn't talk about it.
Yeah, just didn't happen. I love it.
About any of it. To be honest, I started drinking kind of young. I started drinking when I was 14. I was the youngest. My sister's 7 years older than me, and my sister didn't really do anything. And my parents aren't drinkers either. Right. Like my dad will have a beer once a month. You know, my mom really doesn't drink at all. So it was like confusing to them. I think that I had these impulses in me and they didn't really know what to do with it. And I would also just sleep over at friends' houses a lot. In the town I grew up in, I had friends who were in the town next to mine. And they lived in like bigger houses and had parents with liquor cabinets who would then go away for the night or away for the weekend. And like, that's when I feel like the trouble would start. I also went to a sleepaway camp where you were allowed to go to the bar when you were 15.
Oh my God.
So a lot of what I was doing also was like away from home. So my parents didn't necessarily know. I think they had their suspicions, but we didn't talk about it.
Right.
And so as far as I recall, so I feel like I was drinking, but I wasn't like going to bars in New York City until senior year of high school, which I guess is still
early.
Young. Yeah. I had a fake ID and I was 17. I definitely looked like 13 and I was like buying alcohol and getting in places. It's very weird to think about now. But I think like this was the life I aspired to. And what's strange is you think some of this is hyperbolic, but like I knew people who did not to this extreme. They weren't like the princes and princesses of the Upper East Side, but they were going to bars in high school in Manhattan, which is again crazy to think about. But in terms of also the form, I like loved anything, especially when I was younger, that played with form like this. So I thought it was so cool because that was also the beginning of the internet. So to see it in a book and to see people talking how I felt like my friends and I were talking online, it was exciting. And also I felt like the book now is so like prophetic. Everything is like it's all Instagram and Dumois and stuff like this honestly is not that far from what Dumois is.
Oh no, this is exactly that. Yeah.
Yeah.
What's interesting is that I think the internet gave us a place, like for a while at least, where there could be a private, like kids only.
What was your first screen name?
Oh my god. My first email was Big Bird's Best Buddy.
Oh, that's good.
Which was so long, and I think there was at least one typo in there. But what was yours?
My first email address was LDS Puppy.
Your initials.
My initials.
Not the Church of Latter-day Saints.
No. I didn't even know what that was. LDS Lana Schwartz Puppy. Because I like puppies.
There were a lot of like Leah Dog Lover. Yeah. Sarah Dog Lover. A lot of those emails. Yeah.
My most embarrassing, I think, was Supersonic 288, which I chose after an Oasis song. That came later, though. That came in high school.
But that feels very of the time, and I think points for that at least.
Thank you. Another one I had that I think was my longest was Lana Says This. Very on the nose, very meta.
One thing I loved about these books is that they even mention it near the end, is that there are so little stakes, it feels like. You know, they say, no matter what happens to us, we're still going to exist in this world.
Yeah.
And I think the only real consequences that do end up happening happen to Jenny, who is sort of like the poor character. And she, of course, has like severe consequences. She gets assaulted. But for everyone else, it is like, and I think almost the internet plays into that because I grew up in the era where the internet was everywhere. Like it was part of life, but you also had to take classes that were like, don't post pictures of yourself drinking on Facebook. And was really like introductory media literacy and things like that. So it was still sort of evolving. But what I thought was interesting about this is for another episode, we read From the Mixed Up Files of Mrs. Basil E. Frankweiler.
Great book.
Yeah. Of course I linked them in my mind because they're both about like rich kids at the Met. But it's also that like Königsberg, that author, had a very blue-collar upbringing and then got to a point where she was teaching like at a girls' school and saw like, oh, these kids, they have nice shoes, but they have all the same problems that I do, and sort of wrote from that perspective. And so I felt like it was that, but a little edgier, but I mean a lot edgier. And it felt so cynical, which I think makes a lot of sense for 2002. And, but at the same time, it has characters like Blair, who identifies as a hopeless romantic, and I think like by having it so cynical, those really true moments they really took you off guard.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think like in terms of the cynicism, she wrote like herself, she wrote a bunch of these, and then at some point she got a ghostwriter. And in terms of the cynicism, it just like goes off the charts to the point that like they got even nastier to read. That's kind of when I stopped, I think, because I was like, this is like too much.
Right.
But I don't know if you know this, that they made like a serial killer version of these.
I saw like one, and I didn't look into it. Can you say more about that?
I haven't read them, but I think it's like one of them is a murderer, and it's supposed to be like Gossip Girl meets American Psycho, which makes perfect sense because when you read these, there are like tinges of like American Psycho where you feel like somebody's going to ask about like their reservations at Dorsia. Parts of it are so nasty, like the way things are described. There's not really any kind of sympathy for any of the characters except maybe Jenny, but not even her, because like, I mean, also I should add, I was a short brunette girl with curly hair with big boobs. So I obviously identified with her a lot, but the way they wrote about her body made me so uncomfortable
Yeah.
and made me like deeply ashamed. And then also like this is such a 2002 book, and that like the best thing you can be is skinny, you know?
Yeah.
And like if you're not, best of luck to you. You're basically not a human. And so it feels very of that culture of that time. Like you should drink, but don't drink too much. You should have sex, but don't be a slut. Like very like when Paris Hilton and Lindsay Lohan are being like lambasted in the headlines like every day.
Yeah, at your school where they're like kids who went away. Like that's the beginning of no, me either.
I went to a really, really big high school in Queens, like kind of like the polar opposite of what
Yeah.
this would be. There were 4,500 kids. So like nobody like I'm sure there were rich kids, but like I didn't really know them. And it wasn't like people went away and then came back. And it was like
Right.
at least not for the most there's some identification with it for me in terms of I went to elementary school with a lot of people I went to high school with, but not middle school.
Right.
So then there were people that I hadn't seen for 4 years and then reunited with them again. Like one of my best friends still today, we were best friends in elementary school, then went to different middle schools, then became like best friends again in high school. So there was an element of that for sure, but not in terms of anybody like, oh, she's back or like where, you know, where's she been? Was she in like Paris or whatever, you know, that sort of thing. Yeah. Yeah.
I think that was one thing I didn't expect from this book is how well constructed like the high school ecosystem felt. It felt very accurate. I loved that there was that sort of knowledge was social currency.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
And I loved the way that the internet played a role because we definitely I don't feel like the website made an impact necessarily like in the course of the text, but it's really interesting because of course you don't know who Gossip Girl is, and even when you are not in those posts, there is this like ever-present watchful eye. And as the book progressed, there was more and more, I don't know the exact word, but like it stopped being like an unbiased narrator. There were bits of like, attaboy, good. Like, I wouldn't have made that choice. That felt like not only snide and clued in, which I think makes sense because it feels like such a clueless time, but how did the internet play kind of any role in your high school experience?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I definitely like the internet. I remember like a lot of like AIM profiles and away messages or instant messenger chatting with somebody like for hours and then like that sort of thing. I remember really Facebook wasn't like out yet, but I remember like AIM being the biggest thing and like AOL profiles and stuff like that and like that, and you knew people were friends if they had it like in their away message. And like, oh, I guess when I was in high school, MySpace was starting to exist. So I still think about this today, like top 8, like who's in your top 8. That was like a big thing. I wasn't cool enough to be getting like music from MySpace. I don't know if you remember that at all, or if like you.
Yeah, I was a tiny bit after MySpace, very Facebook era.
I feel like that kind of thing was starting to have like a huge impact, and it was like really difficult. Like I'm sure for you too, like with using Facebook, seeing people post on each other's walls or whatever, like I feel like that started to get really hard for like as you matured into that or as like you aged into that.
Was there gossip on the internet in your high school?
I'm trying to remember. There definitely was, but I feel like I'm not like coming up with good answers. I'm so sorry, but there definitely was. I remember one time I had a crush on this guy, and the way we found out that we liked each other was through this new social media website that barely lasted, and it was called Skonex, like skin, like you could connect like through your school or something, and you had to say if you had a crush on somebody, or you didn't have to, but you could say if you had a crush on somebody, but it only told you if it was that person if you liked each other back, and that's how we found out that we liked each other.
I wish that I had had that. That sounds like exactly what you would want. By the time high school was almost over, but I went to a really small high school, and by the end, almost everyone had a Facebook page. If you didn't, it wasn't because you didn't want to, it was because your parents wouldn't let you.
Yeah.
And by the end, there was a page called PHS Crushes, which is the high school acronym, and you could submit and say, anonymously, like, oh, I have a crush on this person. But then people also just started being like, I love this person's hair. This person's, and so it was like very rarely cruel. Bullying was not really a thing at my high school.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I think I went to a weird high school where everything was about academics, and so like I joke that we were all bullying ourselves. There was just sort of like no like bandwidth for it. We're just trying to survive, and which I think was something that surprised me about this book is how relatable those things felt about like college extracurriculars and your resume as a 17-year-old, 18-year-old.
I feel like it doesn't downplay I feel like that was also the era when it started getting really hard to get into college, if that makes sense. Or like when college got really expensive too. Like it always was pricey, but I feel like I remember like being somebody a year older than me told me they were applying to I want to say like something like 30 schools or something like that. Like I feel like that was when all the competitiveness really hit a peak. So I do appreciate that this book like is like doesn't shy away from like like I have to do like my AP homework, and I was also in like these AP classes or whatever, and it was hard. It was a lot of work because it was like I remember taking on all these extracurriculars because I was like, I'm not going to get into college.
What were some of your extracurriculars?
I had so many that like it was like to the point that like I was like all over the yearbook in kind of a way that was like embarrassing, like or just like in yearbook pictures. I started the book club. I was in the Key Club, like the volunteer club, basically. I was in history club. I was on the debate team. I was the secretary of Arista. Arista is the National Honor Society, and I was secretary. I was on the Lit Mag. I was on the newspaper, I think. It was a lot. So I was like, I'm not going to get into college.
Wow. Mine was, I had the opposite problem of like, I had Girl Scouts and piano, and that was kind of it.
I really wanted to do Girl Scouts, and they didn't have a chapter where I grew up. My nieces are in it now, and I'm like, oh, that's so cool.
All of my extracurriculars were decided very early as like, my parents did these, so that's what you're gonna do. And like, there was a lot of like, sports, that's not our family. I don't know, have a musical instrument. Because of Girl Scouts, I ended up starting a knitting club at my high school. It did not last very long. There was a film club that was 2 people. It was me and this upperclassman this was a question I wanted to ask of like, Jenny really idolizes Serena. Yeah. Did you have that or know of that? Was there someone that, everything with Jenny was really fascinating to me.
Yeah. I didn't have that, I don't think at my high school, but I definitely had that at like my sleepaway camp. There were older girls that I definitely thought seemed like so cool, like older counselors who I was like, oh, I want to like, they just seem really fun and like boys like them and stuff like that. And I felt like I was like, I have frizzy hair and nobody will ever talk to me. But yeah, I feel like at my high school, it was so big, truly. Like my graduating class was 850. And I was like, I really feel like I was just trying to survive. Like I had good friends and all of that. But all I really remember about high school is like working hard and like wanting to do well. We had like a split schedule. So my sophomore year, I was going to school 10 a.m. to 5 p.m.
Oh my God.
Like I had a full-time job.
Yeah.
There was obviously like drama and like fighting and stuff like that, but there was no real like in crowd or like popular people. And people would tell themselves that they were, but it's like there's too many of us for anybody to truly be so popular. I was just happy to have like my group. And I feel like I got a lot of like the petty stuff from like my Jewish sleepaway camp and the Jewish youth group I was in, where it was like all mean girls that gave me complexes. That's like where I feel like I can relate to more of that, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Speaking of that like era, that's another thing that's so funny to me about the book is every single line or every other line is like what brand they're wearing. Because like that was also like peak Juicy Couture. I don't know if you had that, like Juicy Couture and Hardtail and like all of these like Jappy brands, and by Jappy I mean Jewish American Princess, which I can say because I'm Jewish. All of these like Jappy brands that were like everywhere, and I feel like that was also like peak consumerism, and that's what this book is like. So much of it's about, and I think if it didn't have that edge, it would be like insufferable. But I think the edge balances it out because these people are clearly not happy and like probably never will be. And I feel like a lot of books and YA books can sometimes really valorize the male characters. The guys in these books suck.
Yeah.
And that's like fine because that's like what men are like.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I didn't know how to highlight, so I took screenshots of pages. Yeah.
I did highlight like the fashion moments that felt very memorable to me, and what made me sad was that when they're describing Dan's fashion as like being out of it, they were describing things that I wore in high school or currently. I remember there was like black faded corduroys, which I did wear all through high school, and he's wearing black hush puppies, and I have a pair of blue hush puppies in the next room. But there was black ballet flats and pink army print handbags and black leather jeans and a purple velvet empire waist sheath dress with beaded straps. There was a lot of beaded going on.
And like everything is like low rise. Also, Dan being from the Upper West Side, like a big thing that the show changed. So in the book, obviously, Dan and Jenny live on the Upper West Side, and their dad is like this big intellectual Marxist type. And I don't know how familiar you are with like Upper East Side versus Upper West Side, but that was kind of like a thing for a long time where like the Upper East Side kids were rich, and it's not like Upper West Side people were poor, but it was like a little more working class. Now, like you can't afford to live anywhere, but like the Upper West Side was like, because I think it was a little more associated with like intellectualism.
Right.
So if you ever seen the movie Metropolitan, it's a Whit Stillman movie.
I don't think so, no.
Okay, well, it's really good. It's kind of like the original Gossip Girl. Everybody's talking about a girl named Serena. So, like, yeah, weird parallel there. But it's a great movie. They're like the rich Upper East Side kids, and then across, like, there's an Upper West Side guy. And he's not like poor, but he's just shabbier in comparison. It's like these two different worlds. And one thing the show does is that instead of living on the Upper West Side, the Humphreys live in Brooklyn, which makes a lot of sense for like 2007 when the show came out, because that was way more of a contrast than Upper East versus Upper West. Even though it had only been 5 years, that was when everybody was talking about Brooklyn. But the thing that the show does that drives me crazy, and even at the time was insane, is they keep saying it's Williamsburg, but it's so clearly Dumbo. And it's infuriating, and it makes me feel like I'm being gaslit. But
no, that happens with shows that are set in DC, because they always get it wrong. My favorite was Bones, because they would be like, I have to go to the Smithsonian, as if it's one building. It's really like 12, but okay.
Yeah. I didn't know Bones took place in DC. Wow.
Yeah, Bones and like X-Files, but X-Files gets it right.
Okay, good to know.
The creator had a brother or a cousin or something who was from where I'm from, so you'll see crawls that are like very accurate. It's a nice little touch.
Oh, okay, that's good to know. I've never watched the X-Files, but I know I probably should.
I mean, it's good if you need. There's so much of it. There's so much of it.
Well, I spent 4 to 5 days watching 2 seasons of the morning show, which we don't have to get into here, but it almost killed me.
I was watching you do that. I've seen very little of the morning show for reasons I think you understand. Yeah.
Probably don't watch it if you want to hold on to your sanity, but if you want to see how far you can be pushed to your limit, then watch it. But I think that's one thing that's very interesting about the book, and then the book versus the TV show, is kind of the way it does talk about like these weird New York City kind of politics, for lack of a better way to describe it.
Did you encounter at all, or like as an adult now, encounter this type of teen?
Definitely, like going to camp, there were some people I knew. They weren't Upper East Side teens, but yeah, they were going to these places. Like they were going to bars. Like I have a friend, and this is actually an old coworker who's, to be fair, she's a good like 6-7 years older than me. But she said she was going to Marquee, which is like a old famous New York bar, when she was 14. So like, yeah, there was a level of this. And if you watch the shows in like the heyday of Gossip Girl, I don't remember the exact year it came out, but there was a show called NYC Prep.
Okay.
And it was a reality show based on kids like this.
Wow. Oh man. I really
I
want
don't
to watch
know
that,
how,
but it also
yeah.
feels exploitative.
Yeah, I don't know how much it showed them like drinking because I don't know if it could get away with that, but like just showing the drama they had.
Yeah.
And I like loved it, obviously. Again, like I think it's one thing, and I have conversations with friends about stuff like this too. It's one thing to like have a fantasy of New York, and like it's another to kind of be here but not able to experience
Right.
anything,
Yeah.
which is how I felt for a long time living in like Fresh Meadows, which is where I'm from, which is New York City. It's Queens, but I'm not, walking out of my apartment and like, I mean, Central Park is obviously an insane thing to see when you walk out of your apartment, but I'm not in the middle of everything.
Right. And that must be interesting and also frustrating that there is such, like, you and these people are existing in the same geographic space, and yet there is such a different experience of what New York is and how you define and how you experience it.
And another thing I should say is like, yeah, like rich kids obviously existed in New York for all time. But when I was younger, you could grow up in Manhattan and it wouldn't automatically mean that you were extremely wealthy. Like there was still much more of like a working or middle class presence in Manhattan. And so I have a friend who grew up like off of Washington Square Park, basically, like downtown. We went to college together. And when I talk to him, he tells me I'm not really from New York.
Oh.
Yeah. I mean, he's that kind of like person. He's whatever, but he's gonna give me a hard time about anything. But yeah, like that's kind of like you'll find people who don't necessarily see you as like a real New Yorker if you're not from Manhattan or I guess like immediately outside of it, like Brooklyn Heights or whatever.
Man, there's a very human need to create hierarchy and structure.
Yes.
And I think high school is maybe one of the best places to explore that. Structure.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. These kids are just so mean to each other because they have everything they want, so they need to create conflict in like any way that they can.
One thing that I really appreciated as a touch was like the intricacies of invitations to any event and who is invited and who isn't, and how do you get people to it without other people knowing. And I loved that this whole benefit that the book is leading up to is for only kids. So I don't understand how they're gonna get money if there are no adults there.
That is a good point. That reminds me, I was talking about American Psycho and like Bret Easton Ellis. I read this thing, I think it was an interview with Candace Bushnell, which I feel like obviously this book is like very like a descendant of Sex and the City, you know what
Absolutely.
I mean? Yeah. Which had like started a few years earlier. And she said that back in the 90s, like, because this was, people just went out like nonstop. If this was 1997 or whatever, you and I we wouldn't be at home. We would be like bars. Like that's what people just did. Like they went out an unbelievable amount. Because like if you wanted to do anything, you had to do it in person pretty much. Like other than talking on the phone, which like wasn't always cheap, you had to just go meet somebody somewhere. So like they all went out so much. And she said this thing about Bret Easton Ellis. She said that because people used to send paper invitations for everything, he had a giant whiteboard and he would put all of his invitations on it and then figure out what to go to each night based on that.
Wow.
I know. Man. I know. It's like so different now. I get emails about stuff, but not a paper invitation unless it's a wedding.
There's this really interesting balance between the very adult things that are happening and how young the kids are.
Yes.
I think the opening page is Blair watching Nickelodeon so that she's not thinking about her mom having sex in the next room over.
Yeah.
It's interesting, obviously, to look at loss of innocence and growing up and things like that, but I think it's also interesting to find those behaviors in adulthood because they're very much there, and there are so many places where things devolve into high school or middle school politics that we just don't have to do, guys.
One thing I like used to say is like no matter like what you're in, like even as adults, if it's comedy, if it's your job, if it's your Zog soccer team, however you spend your time socially, people are going to recreate high school. It's just the truth. It's a really sad truth, but it just is. Like, it's just like instinct. And I think that's like why also she skewers the parents so much is like, because they're clearly, despite all their money, at least talking about Blair's mom, stunted in their own ways.
Yeah, and it's at least with the parents, it's super heightened. I mean, in that like first chapter or two, Blair's soon-to-be stepfather is asking her boyfriend about their sex life.
Yeah.
Which is just, of course, like wildly wrong. In that scene, they bring it up a couple times. Blair sewed this heart into Nate's sweater, which I think is so cute. I definitely felt like a Blair in that I felt like second fiddle. I felt like, you know, everyone wanted my best friend and I was the sidekick. But also, I keep realizing maybe just everybody feels like that. Maybe that's just what it's like.
I only know one person who I think it's a guy, would refer to himself as a Serena. And whenever he says stuff like that, I'm like, you're delusional.
The heart detail I bring up, partly because I really felt for Blair as a character, but also because I was like, you had to learn how to sew. I don't think, like, I learned to sew at Girl Scout camp. I feel like Blair Waldorf would have someone who does that for her. And I think that added, like, a layer of sweetness to it.
That's a good point. Yeah, because, like, it's like, who doesn't see their life as, like, a movie or want everything to feel like it's following a plot, especially, like, her parents got divorced, and also, like, they're writing about her dad being gay and like kind of a way that's like mostly fine, but sometimes you're like, I don't know if this is holding up. And so it's like that's how she's kind of dealing with these like traumatic events, especially for somebody who her and Serena clearly were best friends and she doesn't have anybody that she can lean on. So I think that makes like perfect sense and it's extremely relatable, which also reminds me, I also relate her brother being like obsessed with Almost Famous is like such a funny detail because I was obsessed with Almost Famous. So I feel like thinking back to myself reading this book, probably like jumping up and down in excitement that they mentioned like this movie I loved.
I was really surprised that, first off, that there is a hinted queerness between Blair and Serena. And that it was handled well and respectful, and it wasn't like a joke or a throwaway. I think there's an element definitely with Jenny of, I don't know if you're queer, I am, of feeling like, I don't know if I want to be Serena or be with her.
Right.
And that, like, at least I had that, and I didn't know the difference. I didn't know that I was queer at that point or, like, was able to navigate it. And I think that was one thing I really appreciate about Jenny is the rabidity that she has for all of this.
Yeah, she's just, like, so excited. And so that's why she's so excited that it's like she's kind of the perfect foil for these people to take advantage of her. The books that follow her to boarding school, the tone is like a little nicer, which is interesting and makes me think that's how I know this was written by somebody else.
Right.
Probably two different ghostwriters, because like they talk about her body in a much more like flattering way and not constantly making fun of her for having big boobs.
It was very heavy-handed in terms of the things that don't age well. That was a really big one. And I think the chuck of it all is such a, like, obviously awful person. He's also treated like a doofus and sort of the joke of it. And there's a lot of moments where it's like, you know, Chuck didn't even mind that this girl was passed out. And it's so flippant. And yet Von Ziegesar depicts him as a predator. Like, gives it, you see fully how scary he can be. It was such an odd, not really balancing act, but it just kept flipping. Like, when they introduce him, it's so funny of like, it's this guy who always wears this stupid scarf. It is so hung up on X, Y, and Z. It makes me uncomfortable, I think, because two things can exist in the same person and the danger can cohabitate so easily.
I think that's an extremely good point. And I think like it's really upsetting, but I also feel like that's really how guys were back then and potentially are still now. Like there was always that one friend who was kind of gross. Do you know what I'm talking about?
I wanted to ask about this. Like, what was there a Chuck? Because my high school was so sexually repressed that I didn't know about one.
I feel like it wasn't at my high school, but at my like sleepaway camp or like my Jewish like youth group, you know, I had like a lot of internalized misogyny from it for a really long time because it was just like the way we talked about women was really upsetting. And like it was the same thing like I was saying earlier, like you're expected to do these things, but if you do too much of them, you're a slut, basically, you know. And I wasn't really hooking up or dating at that point in my life other than like a few infractions, but like I was a late bloomer, as they say. So like a lot of that wasn't happening to me until I got a little older. And then I felt like there were definitely instances of things like that happening though to my friends and then later happening to me, where like sometimes you don't have the strength or the energy to deny somebody because they're so persistent.
Right.
And that's really upsetting. It shouldn't be like that. And, you know, I remember like hearing guys say things like, I don't know if you, this is upsetting, but this is the kind of thing they would say, like, no means yes and yes means anal. Like things like that. Yeah, where it felt like we weren't at that place of talking about like consent yet.
With Chuck and the way it's presented and the way it's talked about, it's sort of like a force of nature. Like this is just something that exists and you have to contend with it. Like there are going to be floods sometimes. And that's just part of life, which is horrifying.
No, and that's a good point. And it's like that's especially what these guys are like. These like rich, entitled guys who don't usually hear no, can't understand that somebody like might not be interested. And like what he does to Serena is bad. And then the way he is with Jenny is like horrifying. And then, you know, you get her point of view a little bit, but I feel like she's mostly just embarrassed. But it's like, it's traumatizing that your first sexual encounter is not one that you agreed to. So, I mean, Chuck in the show has a really big part. I don't want to like spoil anything, but he's a really big part of the show. In the book, he wanes. So I don't really remember what his plot lines are, other than I think he honestly mostly becomes for like comic relief. All I remember is at one point he gets a monkey.
Oh, God.
And then I think he comes out as bisexual.
Oh, God. That tracks, you know?
So I don't really know if there's any kind of like redemption or beyond that, just like vindication or justice. Not in the second book. So I'll tell you that much. He's not in it at all, but he comes back, but I don't remember anything except him being kind of like a goof.
Yeah, which is so terrifying. Yeah. The sexual predator is the comedic relief character in a young adult book series.
From what I recall.
Well, I mean, he definitely is in this book. Absolutely.
Yeah. One thing that's really interesting, and I'm so curious if you watch the show, how closely the pilot mirrors the book. I'd say the biggest difference between, other than like where they eventually take the series, obviously, the biggest difference is what it does with the parents. The parents have storylines in a way that they don't in the book.
That makes sense, I guess, from a TV branding standpoint.
Exactly. Yeah. Especially also, which as you maybe know, it's the same people who did the OC. So they kind of follow a very similar formula. And I feel like that having the parents helps them like ground the stories, which also, speaking of, like the OC feels like it's in conversation with Gossip Girl. Like you have these hot teens messing around. I feel like we were in this very materialistic time where you weren't allowed to be like young anymore. Exactly. You know, they talk about getting really drunk in 8th grade, you know,
the way they talk about each other is so crazy. But I know there was a moment where they're talking about that 8th grade party, and I think it's Dan is referred to as kinky. Just like, Jesus Christ.
Yeah, and I feel like that was a real thing I felt growing up, that like, was the idea, like, I think I was just in such a rush to get older. I didn't want to be 14, 15, 16. I wanted to be like older, and I wanted to be seen a certain way, and there was no level of like, oh, I should enjoy my youth. Like, I can't wait to be of a certain age so I can dress a certain way, drink, come into my own. And there was no real focus on like, even though I was really busy with school and extracurriculars, and I knew I like wanted to be a writer, it wasn't like, oh, I should enjoy this time in my life and not grow up too fast. Because all I was seeing was like Mean Girls, or like girls who were older than me but like said to be my age, and what they looked like on screen. In retrospect, I think this book plays into that a lot.
I think the culture said this probably for a long time, and the media was screaming it, that the worst thing in the world that you could be is a teen girl. It's just, you have no value, no respect. Even the content created for you is deemed trash.
I rewatched American Pie, I think, during the pandemic. What they do to like Shannon Elizabeth. Have you seen that movie?
I haven't seen it, no.
Oh.
I never watched it because my parents were like, this will scar you if you see Allison Hannigan outside of Buffy. Like, you just won't get it, and it'll traumatize you. And now I'm very good friends with Sean William Scott, who is the sweetest, purest person in the world.
Yeah,
and
that's so funny.
I don't want to see him as Stifler.
I understand. Just on its face, like, they live stream Shannon Elizabeth naked. And, like, that's not okay to, like, show a naked woman without her knowledge to like hundreds, thousands of people, and it was played for laughs. And like, you're coming into this time where it feels like you kind of have to be, like, for lack of a better way to put it, like a pick-me, so like men don't treat you a certain way. Or it's like, I think also plays a lot into like the Madonna horror complex. Like,
absolutely,
you can't be like a girl and be sexual and be seen like still as a person. You're one or the other. And, you know, not to say that we've gotten rid of all this completely, but obviously it's miles and miles away better than it used to be.
There was such an interesting moment, because, you know, there's this conflict and tension through the book of will Blair and Nate have sex, and there's this moment really early on, I think they're making out, and it says Blair tries to remain fragile and baby bird-like in his arms, and that, I needed to sit with that for a while, you know?
There were a lot of things that really stayed with me. This is from, I think, maybe the second book. I reread that first before I reread the first one. And the second book, Nate puts his hand on Blair's stomach, and it's like, a man should never put his hand on a woman's stomach unless she asks him to. And it's like things like that I really internalized, I guess.
That's crazy. And like, on that, Blair spends so much time romanticizing her life and dreaming about what it could be. Even then, like, there's also another moment really early on where she's describing the ideal movie. And it's that they're married and Nate has a drinking problem and she would stand by him and love him forever, even if he occasionally wet the bed. It's like, good Lord, this is the dream? This is what you think you deserve?
Yeah.
Jesus Christ.
So he, like, needs her. He depends on her, because otherwise it's like she can't imagine a man, like, just choosing to be with her of his own volition.
Yeah, she is not presented with a role that she could play outside of being a support.
Yeah, I'm sure that's like what they see their parents doing. You know, they're playing that out. This did bring back like certain memories for me. Like, she said something about like a Daffy's bag, and I was like, I remember Daffy's, and like random things like that. But one thing that I thought was so funny is, and I always tell people, like, Williamsburg stopped being like cool way before you thought it did. Like, it hasn't been cool in like 20 years. But the way I know this is because Vanessa's sister lives in Williamsburg. If the characters of Gossip Girl are going to Williamsburg, then like it's already over.
Yeah.
That's like a little bit of an exaggeration, but I was like, that's so interesting that it was already kind of in the conversation like that. Except she does say that Vanessa finds a crack pipe on the street in Williamsburg, and I'm like, you wouldn't find that now.
Is Vanessa in the show at all?
She is. They wait a little bit to introduce her. It's similar in that, like, she wants to be a filmmaker.
She was the character that I actually ended up identifying the most with.
Yeah, that's fair. Lot. She's supposed to be like another like moral compass for Dan, but ends up getting kind of also sucked into this world. I will say, I'm guessing you've seen like posters of the show or people, Leighton Meester and Blake Lively, impeccable casting. Like, I remember when the show was coming out, and I knew who Blake Lively was because of Sisterhood of the Traveling Pants.
Right.
And I was like, that makes perfect sense. Everybody they cast in every role is like 100% right.
I've never watched a second of the show, but I know the characters, I know the names, I know the faces, and it did feel like, even just reading it with a poster amount of context, the casting felt so good. There was even like when Serena makes her big entrance at the first party, like the she's back moment, they say that she has this magnetic, delicious, you can't stop looking at me, can you smile? And I know that, but I'm 25, and yet she's a fascinating character because she knows how she's perceived and yet has the like wherewithal to stare back. And has this gumption that by all rights she shouldn't have, because the world should have like chewed her up and spit her out.
Yeah. The show is a little more sympathetic of her than the book is. The book, I feel like, can't really decide how it feels about her.
Precisely, yeah. Because I
Yeah.
think the reader ends up, I felt sympathy for her, but the tone in which, like, Gossip Girl, the character, has so much disdain for her.
Yeah. And it's also just less clear, and maybe it's, I mean, on purpose or whatever, what she actually like did that was like when she was gone, or what, you know what I mean? And like
Yeah.
in some ways it's like that's nobody's business. The show is a little more like she's not as bad as like the rumors. It's a little more definitive about that.
Right. Through Jenny and the way she sees her, I think it is very interesting and successful to market a book as like, this is the mean girls, you know, of your school. This is the girl that, you know, you hate but you want to be. So you go into it expecting to loathe her, and they trick you, and by the end you really care about her.
Yeah.
And you see how the whole world is set up against her.
It's true. That was also at a time she goes to Chelsea where like uptown and downtown was still like a different thing. Whereas now, I don't know, like I read this other book that takes place, it's like current, follows like a girl who's from one of these families, and then it's like a more serious like novel. It's called Necessary People. And it follows a girl from one of these families and then her college roommate who was not born into a lot of money and then kind of benefits from being so close with somebody from like a dynasty. They talk about like fancy restaurants like this place Daniel, which I think also maybe gets referenced in one of the Gossip Girl books. But I'm like, I don't think people my age care about that world anymore so much.
Yeah.
I don't have friends who want to go to the Carlisle for dinner. I feel like that's also something that really shifted. The people who, you know, are in their 20s and 30s who when they get money, they're not looking to like go to the Four Seasons or the Beverly Hills Hotel. They want to go to like Little Dom's. You know what I'm talking about? Just to throw in an LA reference. I don't know if that's even a good one.
I arrived in LA, you know, 6 months before COVID.
Oh, yeah.
But also, like, I don't know if I would even know that in a pre-COVID world, because I love being at home. You know?
Fair. Extremely fair. I feel like there's more interest in trendy things than like this old world that you used to previously aspire to. I don't think I know anybody who, if they got $1 million and could buy an apartment anywhere, they would say, I want to live on the Upper East Side. They would want to get a place in like Fort Greene, you know?
Yeah. Maybe the apt comparison for LA is like no 20-something wants to go to like Musso and Frank's, which is like one of the oldest in LA. And like, I'm very into classic Hollywood, so I'll read about like the places that everyone wanted to be seen and everyone had dinner together. And obviously LA, New York, very different cities, but those at one time were legacy establishments. And now there's so much turnover. You talked about how sort of like prescient she is in some ways, and I love that Serena's first day back opens with almost a land acknowledgement for one teacher. She says, especially for the Native Americans that were slaughtered in the founding of this country, of whom we ask no hard feelings for celebrating Columbus Day yesterday. Good job, Cecily.
Also, I have been to Musso and Frank's, so I get it.
Yeah.
It's a good reference for me. It's like a fun thing to do.
Yeah. I think it's a thing to do once, I guess, rather than a place to be every Friday.
Yeah, and I agree with that. Like, I did it once. I don't live in LA, but I visited a lot, so I went once, and it was a fun thing to do, as opposed to, like, if I lived in LA, I'd probably go to Covell, like, every weekend, you know? Just also, the gallery is called White Hot Gallery, and that made me laugh, because I was like, try a little harder. Screenshot
Do we ever find out?
It is funny. She's like 17 and then immediately accosted by like two short gay men who are like all over her. And I'm like, this is so weird.
Yeah. And they're like, let's put, I mean, what I assumed to be a butthole on the side of a bus, which is just, and it has her name, Serena, written in blue in the corners. And everyone knows it has to be this one high schooler.
Yeah. That's an extremely good point. I screenshotted. Okay, I'm obsessed with the list of celebrities who, honestly, the ratio of people that are still pretty famous today is like, because Kate Moss, Kate Hudson, Joaquin Phoenix, Jude Law, Giselle Bundchen, Cher, Eminem, Christina Aguilera, Madonna, Elton John. Those like strike me as all pretty famous people still. And then she mentions like the magazines like Art Forum, Vogue, W. Harper's Bazaar, and the New York Times. And I'm like, oh, I remember when that meant something, like that when magazines existed. It's just like so different, like the amount of power now, or like, I mean, there are still people this stuff matters to, and a world where like it's still a big deal to be in the Sunday Times, the style section. It's just so different than like when I was younger and like starting to be aware of the world.
Yeah.
You know?
I feel like there's just so many more options, and the proliferation of options makes you care less, I think.
And also the people who were writing for the magazines were making enough money to like live not quite in this world, but in the world. And now it's like none of these people make any money, so it's like they're not quite seen at the same level, if that makes sense.
The same parties.
Yeah, exactly. She mentions a bar that I went to when I was right out of college called The Park, and that made me laugh because I used to go out when I was early 20s, like meatpacking and like Chelsea, and I feel like that was also something that was like a big deal at the time because it was just starting to become what it is like. Well, I actually don't even really know what it is now, but starting to become a thing. And now it's like the window of like trendy New York to like completely oversaturated in New York is like this big.
It's a day. It's
it's a day. Yeah. Did you like the book? I think you
absolutely
said
the best word I can use is delectable.
Delectable. I love that. If you watch the show, if you like the book, you will love the show. It is like that first season is like so fun to watch. It's extremely like juicy. You know,
that's exactly the word.
Yeah, because it takes everything that's set up here. I think this is a really good primer, but I think the show just takes it further in a way that makes you care more, and I think does not a better job in some ways as a satire than the book does.
The book is written in this very flippant tone that is obviously purposeful, but I think in the end, like one thing that I was really struck by is that the character of Gossip Girl is very upfront about, I want to be famous. I love fame. And I think, like, we don't get that these days anymore.
It's actually really fascinating to me because, like, it was a time when being famous meant, like, being famous meant still a level of privacy that just doesn't exist now. And I can tell this kind of all folds a lot of different things together. I can tell Variety is running out of things to write about because they aggregated Olivia Rodrigo saying she had to walk out of the Ari Aster movie but was afraid. And I was like, why is this a headline from Variety? It's something she talks about so briefly in an interview with Phoebe Bridgers. And then they're like, Olivia Rodrigo had to walk out of Ari Aster's movie. It's like, who the fuck cares? You know, it's like you can say anything. And like, obviously it's a little different right now because like these places are like, they don't have anything to literally don't have anything to write about because like the strikes. But I'm like, so much, especially with the strike, which obviously it's good the strike is happening, etc. But you can really see how it's affecting these outlets because they're taking like even more so podcasts, interviews, and just aggregating. I had to say it 3 times. And I think it just feels like probably a level of like, oh, I can't say anything, you know, which is so crazy. And it's hard that I've been thinking about this a lot because also I'm curious if you agree with me. I feel like for a long, long time, we wanted our rock stars to be like larger than life, right? We wanted them to be like Mick Jagger, Keith Richards. I think now what we want from celebrities is we want them to be relatable. And I feel like we used to not have that. And I think it speaks to like her being like, I want to be famous because now if somebody said that, we'd be like, that's gauche. You know what I mean? You're supposed to want to be normal. So do you listen to like Boy Genius?
Yeah.
I was reading this interview between Phoebe Bridgers and Olivia Rodrigo, and Phoebe Bridgers is like, we don't go to the bar after we cuddle. And I was like, I don't believe you.
No.
I don't believe you. I'm sorry. Like, I think you're lying. Stop lying. But another thing that this book, in terms of Gossip Girl, reminds me of, because we were talking about celebrity, is like the writer being a celebrity, which like we have famous writers, but not like we did probably when like Cecily von Ziegesar, who, you know, is coming like up in the 90s, early 2000s, is seeing like Jay McInerney, and I know I talked about Bret Easton Ellis, but like writers at like the MTV Awards, you know what I mean? Like she's seeing them like be these really influential people in culture. And again, writers are important, but they're not celebrities the way they were. And I think that is an interesting to think about in terms of like Gossip Girl as well. And because also like in that sense, like she is kind of like a puppet master too. Like she controls what gets written about these people. There's things the TV show does with Gossip Girl themselves. That's all I'll say.
Okay.
Because I don't want to ruin anything for you, that are annoying. And I kind of wish they'd talk about who Gossip Girl is and want to find out. And I'm like, that's one thing I wish the show hadn't done. Because it's like,
is that present
I don't care
in any of the books at all about trying to find out who?
I don't think so. I think it's just something they like live with and deal with and don't really worry about, from what I recall. And then on the show, I could be wrong though, but on the show, a whole thing is sending tips into Gossip Girl and who sent it and why and like that kind of thing, and people lying to Gossip Girl. It becomes much more of like a present thing than just a blog. People want to know who Dumois is and like, is Dumois being honest, and like who sends tips to Dumois is important context, because a lot of times it's publicists and a lot of times they're fake. And like she's talked about her like screening process, which there's not much of one, but there is one light one, and it makes sense to want to know.
And everybody, I mean, wants a mystery, I guess.
Yeah. Wow. I didn't watch Bridgerton, but I guess it's like a similar. I watched some of the first season, and I guess it's like a similar idea in terms of like Lady Whistledown and who is Lady Whistledown.
And I mean, that makes sense of that and Gossip Girl and things like that are in the zeitgeist in an internet age where like surveillance feels like a very real
that's
phenomenon.
True. That's true. And also people probably were starting to like stay home more and like going online more. So of course that's gonna spring up.
I love the way they introduce Vanessa as like she is taking everything seriously and no one else is, because that was definitely me, especially in the 2-person film club.
I love that.
Their go-to lunch is lemon yogurt and romaine lettuce.
I like that his dad calls Sears the proletariat department store.
I was really struck by the purity almost of some of the brother-sister relationships.
Yeah.
Like Serena talks really fondly about her brother like going out to buy maxi pads when she gets her period for the first time. There's such a sweet thing between Dan and Jenny, even that like Jenny is always updating him on Serena, even though he doesn't ask for it, and he acts like bothered by it.
Yeah. Their relationship does feel very like, like the pure relationships. It feels purposeful in the sense that like, I mean, Serena has her brother Eric, but I feel like nobody else has these nice strings-free relationships. You know what I mean? Which like in theory should be how Serena and Blair are to each other, because like they were like sisters, but obviously it's like a lot more complicated than that.
That's such a good point.
Yeah.
Like, you have someone automatically on your side.
When she orders a rum and Coke, and then I was like, yuck. And then she says, I'll have a shot of Stoli and a Coke on the side. I was like, that's disgusting. For some reason, I'm picturing this rum and Coke to be warm. And I don't know. I don't know why, but I'm like, ooh.
The attitude in the book, and I think Blair does this to herself, is like, oh, poor Blair. And it'd be like, Blair's drink would be room temperature.
Also, another thing is that they all have to throw up like all the time.
Oh my god.
In addition to Blair's bulimia, I feel like they're all constantly like nauseous and drinking on an empty stomach, which also feels very 2000s culture.
Well, like, are they ever sober, you know?
And then her Cosmopolitan at a fancy hotel bar only costs $20 with tip, and I was like, it's nice that would cover that, because it wouldn't now.
I think in that same scene, Blair says what I think might be like one of the most effective insults ever, where she tells Serena, I feel sorry for your parents.
Oh, I know.
Oh.
Yikes. I mean, I appreciate that they're kind of like, if you party all the time, school's going to be hard.
Yeah. At one point, Nate cuts Jim to go play soccer in Central Park. It's like, dude, that's the same thing. You're cutting class to do the exact same thing.
Oh, and also another big difference. I don't want to spoil like too much again, but the schools aren't like, they're like brother and sister schools, so they share a building, which makes a lot more sense.
Yeah, Dan is there's so many cabs. It's gotta be so expensive.
I hated this time, but I'm also nostalgic,
Mhm.
unfortunately.
You talked about like wanting to be out of it so much that you didn't
Yeah.
you didn't take the time to enjoy it.
Yeah.
And in one of the moments, Gossip Girl is writing at some point, and she goes, "At least I've given us all something to think about while we're getting our pedicures, plucking our eyebrows, and squeezing our zits." And I was like, oh, that was like a community and a shared experience.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of like the thing of it all, of being a teen, is that it feels isolating.
Yeah.
And that no one else is going through it. But like, oh, that was a shared experience I didn't relish when I had it.
And just how easy it was to like see your friends, and like you all lived around each other. It's hard to get stuff like that back.
Yeah. It's all the nastiest parts that I miss in a way. Like, how do you feel having read it as an adult and come off this experience?
Well, it's hard for me in a way because, like I said, like I rewatched the show so much, and I was in a Gossip Girl DM group for a lot of the pandemic.
Good.
So, yeah, so I feel like the book is a lot of what I remember, and it's weird to like see certain words or phrases and like remember, oh, I really internalized this so much, or I remember reading this, or like this at this point, these books, I was reading them a long time ago, and I remember reading one, and she's describing like fall in New York and how beautiful it is, and it's not because of climate change. New York in the fall is not what it used to be. You know what I mean? So like I remember like reading my book and like looking up and like feeling like, oh, it is beautiful, these trees or whatever. And now we don't have that. So yeah, it's like this weird mix of like, thank God our culture doesn't look like this, but this is so prescient. But also like I miss this time, but I don't. And like a weird combination of feelings. And also, this book is better written than it has to be.
Yeah, and I think better written than it gets credit for. I think it's like it's trash maybe in the content, but not in the execution.
Yeah,
and there is real craft and artistry in that.
I would agree. And I think like one thing I'll say that's really interesting is I do think the books, obviously the TV show too, but the books burn through plot pretty fast.
Yeah.
So, because I read the second one, so it's like things that get set up here are already pretty much done by the second book. So
it's very like neat.
Yeah, so it's interesting how fast these things go, but I don't really remember so much beyond that, more like flashes of the other books that came after. And I do have some specific memories of the It Girl series when Jenny goes to boarding school.
So my last question, would you consider it required reading? And that can be not necessarily in school. It can even be like required just to know you. But
to know me? Yeah, I think so. I think like a book like this also is really important to my sensibilities in terms of like skewering certain aspects of culture and also making fun of rich people and making fun of like what's popular in our culture. So I do think, I wouldn't say my comedic voice is like this. I think the fact that this just isn't wholesale, these kids are rich and they're having the time of their lives is really important. And I think like it's a good primer for a lot of what the culture was at the time and then what came after. Absolutely. So definitely required reading for me, and then in terms of understanding the time period for sure.
It really is a time capsule. And it has, I think, a lot more nuance than it is given credit for.
Yeah, I would agree. I sincerely hope you watch the show. Please let me know. Please keep me updated. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. Is there anything you want to plug as we're winding down?
No, just buy my book if you want. And that's kind of all I have going on right now in terms of, and also follow me on Twitter at _LanaBell. Or on Instagram, character actress Lana Schwartz.
Perfect.
Well, thank you so much. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, this is Erin, a couple of weeks later, recording on my phone's voice memos app. I've been informed that the end of these episodes are a little abrupt, so next week on the pod, your homework is to read The Princess Diaries by Meg Cabot from 2000. Our guest will be Allison Reese. I'm Erin Bowles. You can find me at Erin R. Bowles on all platforms. And once the SAG-AFTRA strike ends, please cast me. Thank you. Good night.